Russian pianist Andrei Gavrilov playing some of the movements by Prokofiev of the Romeo and Juliet suites. Later on, we'll take another look at the speaking portion from this 20th anniversary of Perestroika, including former Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev and Bill Clinton. That's here on C-SPAN 2 later on, about 11 p.m. Eastern Time.
Keynotes the Iowa Republican Party's annual Ronald Reagan dinner. Senator Frist has been mentioned as a possible presidential candidate in 2008, and this marks his first trip to Iowa this year. Tennessee Senator Bill Frist, live Saturday night at 8:45 on C-SPAN. You can also see his address to Iowa Republicans Sunday on C-SPAN's Road to the White House 2008. C-SPAN's Road to the White House 2008 airs Sundays at 6:30 and 9:30 p.m. Sunday, on C-SPAN's Q&A, Representative Grace Napolitano, the fourth-term California Democrat and chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, discusses U.S. immigration policy and the impact of the Hispanic vote in congressional and presidential elections. Representative Grace Napolitano, Sunday at 8 Eastern and Pacific, on C-SPAN's Q&A.
You can also listen to Q&A on C-SPAN Radio. It's available on XM Satellite Radio, Channel 132, and on Sirius Satellite Radio, now on Channel 139. And also available as a C-SPAN podcast.
Mikhail Gorbachev celebrates the 20th anniversary of Perestroika, his reforms which led to the end of the Cold War. The former Soviet leader is joined by Bill Clinton, Ted Turner, and Colin Powell, who was President Reagan's national security advisor. This is just over an hour and a half.
We ready? 20 years ago, President Mikhail Gorbachev launched Perestroika, the process of change in the Soviet Union. President Gorbachev's bold initiatives changed the world by helping to end the Cold War and by paving the way to greater global cooperation and peaceful coexistence among nations. On this special evening, on this 20th anniversary of Perestroika, please join me again in welcoming President Mikhail Gorbachev.
Спасибо. Добрый вечер, уважаемые дамы и господа.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Я всех вас приветствую
I would like to welcome you all,
и благодарю за то, что вы откликнулись на
And
мое
thank you all
приглашение
for
провести эту встречу.
coming at my invitation to this meeting.
Я хотел бы особо
I would like in particular
поблагодарить
to
президента
thank
Билла Клинтона
President Bill Clinton
за его дружескую поддержку.
for his friendly support.
Теперь, когда мы не стали президентами, мы лучше
Now that
работаем
both of us
совместно.
are no longer presidents, we work together better.
Я благодарю государственных секретарей.
I would like to thank Secretaries of State,
Можно употребить
Colin Powell,
слово старого, но
my
молодого человека, но старого друга.
old friend, a young man but an old friend.
С ним мы начинали первые шаги по
We took
разоружению.
first steps
Самые трудные
toward disarmament, working on the most difficult problems together.
Я приветствую
I
госпожу Мадлен
also would
Albright,
like to welcome Secretary of State Madeleine Albright,
министра Карлуччи,
Secretary Carlucci,
и поскольку прямо передо мной вот
And,
здесь
also
Кэстенер, я его как друга
Ted Turner,
приветствую.
who is facing me here.
Благодарю Ширли Маклейн,
Also, my friend, I would like to thank Shirley
Человек, который
MacLaine,
нас встретил
who
на американской земле
welcomed
большими
us
чувствами, открытостью своей.
in America
Спасибо.
with warm and emotional feeling and great openness.
И,
Thank you.
конечно, я благодарю
And
нашего
of course,
посла.
I would like to thank
Ushakova и
our
Ushakova.
ambassador, the Russian ambassador Yuri Ushakov and Mrs. Ushakov.
Если бы я сейчас начал перечислять,
If
кому
I
я испытываю личные
listed
симпатии,
now
это, наверное,
all
затянуло
of
бы
those
нашу
of you
процессию. Но
whom I
я
regard
всех
as friends,
приветствую.
that
Приветствую
would take
сенаторов,
too much time. But I would like to
Приветствую
welcome you
послов,
all, the senators,
работали
the
в
ambassadors
Советском
who
Союзе.
worked in the Soviet Union.
с многими из них мы и сейчас
With
продолжаем
many of them,
сотрудничать.
we continue to
Я
cooperate.
приветствую
I also
представителей прессы,
Want to greet
Науки,
the members of the press,
деятелей культуры.
people from the academic community and the arts.
Уже и новые лица появились.
I
Но
see some new
большинство
faces,
это
but
тех,
most
с кем
of you
мы
present here are
встретились
people
в годы
with
перестроечные.
whom we met during the years of perestroika.
Я об этом буду говорить.
I'll
Но я должен
be
быть
speaking
кратким.
more about this, but of course I need to be brief tonight.
Я просто должен сказать, что пока я за регламентом говорю, это слова, которые я
Let me
должен
just
сказать.
say that this, my thanks to you are not
Я
within
хотел бы сразу
my time
поблагодарить
frame,
поблагодарить
and I would like also
организаторов,
to thank the organizers
которые за короткое время провели уникальную работу по подготовке этой встречи.
did really unique work in a very brief period of time to
И прежде
prepare
всего
this
сотрудников
evening.
моего
I would like
фонда,
to thank members of
Международного фонда Фрэнк,
the Gorbachev Foundation,
торгово-промышленной палаты
the
Соединенных
Frank
Штатов
Foundation,
Америки.
and also the U.S.
Без их усилий
Trade
это
Chamber,
оказалось
the
бы
U.S. Chamber of
невозможно.
Commerce.
Большое спасибо
All of them
всем
worked
вам
hard.
за то,
Thank you
что
all
сделано здесь.
for organizing this.
И теперь я хочу к вам обратиться с кратким словом.
And now let me say a few words
Я не буду
addressing
вдаваться
you.
в
I
историю,
will
и
not
только два факта.
go back very deep into history, but
10
let me just
марта
cite two facts.
1985
On March
года
the 10th,
в 7 часов вечера
1985, at 7
я получил
o'clock in the
сообщение
evening, I learned
о кончине
about
генерального
the
секретаря
death
ЦК
of
КПСС
General Secretary
Константина
of
Черненко.
the Central Committee, Konstantin Chernenko.
Особенность того момента такова,
That was a
что из
special
жизни
moment.
ушел
because that was the passing away
третий генеральный секретарь за неполных
a
3 года.
third general secretary in less than 3 years.
В советской системе этот пост давал человеку
Within the
такие
Soviet
права и
system,
возможности,
that
которыми
office gave
и
its holder
отдаленно не располагал
the
ни один глава
possibilities and
государства
the
в более-менее
rights
цивилизованной стране.
that were much, much more than any other world leader
А в
in any
данном случае
civilized
речь шла об
country.
одной из сфер державы.
And this was
Ситуация
in
требовала
one of the
немедленных
superpowers,
действий.
and therefore we needed
В
to
22 часа
act
того же
immediately.
дня было созвано
At 10
заседание
p.m.,
Политбюро.
we convened the meeting of the Politburo.
За 20 минут до начала его заседания я
20 minutes
встретился
before
тет-а-тет
the meeting
с Андреем
of the
Громыко,
Politburo, I
министром
had a
иностранных дел,
one-on-one
членом
meeting
Политбюро.
with Andrei Gromyko, member of the Politburo and Minister of Foreign
Я
Affairs.
откровенно сказал ему
I said to him
о
very
своей
frankly
оценке ситуации,
what my evaluation of the
в
situation
которой
was,
находилась страна.
of the situation in the
И
country.
главное, что
And
общество ждет
I
перемен.
said that I believed that our society was
И мы должны
looking
на
for
них
changes,
решиться.
was expecting changes, and therefore
Будет трудно,
we
очень
needed
трудно.
to find the courage,
Но
to muster
другого пути
courage
я
to
просто
start
не вижу.
changes. It'll be difficult, I said, but I see no
Я
other
пригласил
way forward.
Громыко
I invited Gromyko
действовать вместе.
to work together,
Ответ его был
and
ясным
his
и
reply
позитивным.
was clear and positive.
Он согласен с моей оценкой
He said that
ситуации
he
в
agreed
стране
with my evaluation of
и
the
готов к
situation in the
совместным
country
действиям.
and was ready to work together.
Беседа длилась примерно 10 минут.
We talked for about 10 minutes.
Оказывается, для того, чтобы решить большие вопросы, вовсе не нужно.
Sometimes in
Тратить
order
силы.
to solve big
Дни,
problems,
месяцы и годы.
it doesn't take many days or months or years.
11 марта
On
1985 года
the 11th of
состоялся
March,
пленум Центрального комитета,
the plenary meeting of
который
the
избрал
Central
нового
Committee
генерального
took
секретаря
place,
ЦК КПСС.
which elected the new
Так
General Secretary
началась
of the Central Committee.
новейшая
This
история
was the beginning of
в развитии моей страны,
the
тот самый
modern
период,
phase in the
который
history
назван
of
перестройкой.
my country, the period that was named
В
perestroika.
1985 году
In
новое
1985,
советское
the
руководство
new Soviet leadership
могло двигаться по инерции,
could, of course,
осуществляя
continue
корректировки
to go
не принципиально,
on the
не
path
принципиального
of inertia, making small, insignificant
Как вы
adjustments.
знаете,
But as you know,
поступили по-другому.
we did something
Для
quite
того,
different.
чтобы это произошло,
In order for this to
нам
happen,
надо было выйти на
we
обновление
needed
состава руководства,
to start
что
changing
сделано безотлагательно
the
было.
leadership of the country, and
На новые
we did that
оценки ситуации в
without
стране и
delay.
в состоянии
We also
мира,
needed to evaluate the situation in the country
его
and
опасностей
in the
и
world,
угроз.
to assess the
Так
dangers
сформировалось новое
and the
мышление для
risks
страны и остального
existing
мира.
in the world. We started to shape
Мы
new
получили
thinking
поддержку
for our country
своих
and for the
граждан в
world.
стране.
We received support from our
Осуществили
people,
политические
from
и
the citizens of our
экономические реформы.
country. We started implementing political and economic reforms.
Перестройка, тем не менее,
Perestroika,
оборвалась в
nevertheless,
декабре
was
1991
interrupted
года
in December
под ударами двух заговоров.
1991 as a
Буча
result of
и
two
Беловежского
conspiracies.
сговора.
First, the coup in August,
Но
and
она
then
довела
the
преобразовательные процессы
Belovezhskaya Pusha
до того
conspiracy.
пункта, откуда уже
However,
нет
Perestroika
возврата
brought
в
the
прошлое.
country to a point of no return to the past.
Нас, граждан России, вас, наших друзей, конечно,
So,
многое может
of course,
беспокоить, возникать
we,
вопросы.
as
Это
citizens of
понятно,
Russia,
мы все хотим,
and you,
чтобы
our friends,
это начатое дело
may be worried
совершилось
or concerned
успешно,
about many
созданием
things because we want
развитого
this project
демократического
to
свободного
succeed
государства.
by
Но одно
creating
ясно, и в этом
an
вы должны
advanced,
быть уверены,
democratic and
что
free
возврата в
nation.
прошлое не
But
будет.
one thing is clear, and again I say, there is no return to the past. There can be no return to the past.
На основе нового мышления мы
On the
осуществили
basis of the
обновление
new
нашей внешней
thinking,
политики.
we changed our
И
foreign
встретили
policy,
понимание,
and
хотя не сразу,
we were
стороны Соединенных
understood,
Штатов Америки,
even though this
стран
did not
Запада,
happen immediately.
других
We
государств,
met with
народов.
understanding from the United States,
Наши
from other
партнеры
countries
приглядывались к
and
ним.
nations. Our partners
раздавались голоса,
took some time, and some of
что надо
them
посмотреть, не
said
спешить
that, well,
и не
we
предаваться иллюзиям в
have
отношении
to
заявлений нового
wait and
руководства.
see. We should be under
Мы
no
знаем
illusion
этих
about
самых
the
генеральных секретарей.
statements of the new Soviet leaders. They said, we know all about
Нам
those
хватило
general
терпения,
secretaries. We,
настойчивости
however,
и доброй воли
had enough patience, enough
проведению перестроечного
persistence
курса
and
международных
enough
отношений.
goodwill to continue a course of
Результатом
perestroika
наших
also
усилий
in international
и усилий
affairs.
наших
The result
партнеров,
of our efforts
прежде всего
and the
Соединенных
efforts
Штатов
of our
Америки,
partners,
стали
the United
продуктивный
States in
диалог,
particular, were a
доверие и
productive
постепенное
dialogue,
освобождение
trust,
международных
and
отношений
a
от
gradual
идеологической
change in international relations that we rid from political
составной части
and
и от
ideological
конфронтации.
component, that we rid also from
Мы решили
confrontation.
многие проблемы и
We
проблему
were
ядерной
able
угрозы
to solve many international problems,
и
including
конфликты,
averting
которые
the threat of
пылали
nuclear war,
на всех
including also
континентах,
ending
во всех
regional
регионах
conflicts
мира.
in different parts of the world.
И самое главное, мы
And what is most
преодолели
important,
раскол
we were
Европы и
able
мира
to overcome the division
и
of
открыли
Europe
возможности
and
для
the world,
демократических
and
процессов.
to open conditions to
Эти достижения
open
перестройки
conditions for
мы
a
рассматриваем
democratic
как
process. We regard these achievements of perestroika as a
трансформационные.
real transformation.
Почему?
Why is that?
Потому что
Because
в конечном счете
in the final
реализация
analysis,
того стратегического плана,
realizing the strategic
который имела
plan
перестройка,
that perestroika contained
еще впереди.
is still in the future.
Уже и другие планы, уже и другие стратегии, и
now
тем не менее
Other
остается
plans
то,
and
что
other
мы сказали
strategies,
тогда
but nevertheless,
миру.
that strategy is
В
still in
исторической
effect. What we
перспективе
said
это
at that
означает
time to
победу
the world is
перестройки.
still in effect. So historically, that means a victory of perestroika.
Думаю, она стала
I believe
возможной
that
прежде всего
perestroika
потому, что мы
succeeded
не
above all
ошиблись
because we
в анализе и оценках
properly
ситуации в стране
and
и в мире,
correctly evaluated the situation in the country and in the
в
world.
главных констатациях и принимаемых
In our
решениях.
principal assessments
констатировали, что
and in
страна
our main
нуждается
decisions,
в кардинальных
we turned
переменах.
out to be right. We stated
И на
that
втором
our
этапе
country needed really
пришли к выводу,
radical
что
change.
нужно менять
And in the
систему.
second phase of perestroika, we all agreed
Мы
that the
констатировали,
system
что помимо
needed to be
классовых,
replaced.
национальных,
We also stated that in
государственных
addition
интересов
to class interest,
существуют
national
интересы
interest,
общечеловеческие,
state interest, there are also universal
цели,
interest of all mankind
главный из
and
них
universal objectives of all
избавление
mankind,
человечества
and that the
от
main
угрозы
objective
исчезновения.
is ridding mankind of the threat
Мы
of
констатировали, что живем
annihilation.
во взаимосвязанном
We
и
also stated
взаимозависимом
that we
мире,
lived in
где
a
ни одна
interdependent
страна
and
не может
interrelated
обеспечить
world
свою
in which no
безопасность и
country
благополучие
can
в одиночку.
assure its security and well-being alone.
Отсюда вытекали наши принципиальные
Based on that,
стратегические решения.
we took
Наш выбор в пользу
important
свободы,
strategic decisions.
демократии,
We chose
правового
freedom,
государства,
democracy,
прекращение
the rule of
гонки
law,
вооружений
ending
и
the arms
прекращение
race, and
глобальной
also
конфронтации.
ending the global confrontation.
Уроки тех времен
The lessons
важны
of
для
that time
нынешних
are
условий.
important for the current conditions as well.
В чем-то мир
The world,
быстро
of course,
изменился,
has
причем
changed very rapidly.
изменился даже коренным образом и
And,
продолжает меняться.
In some respects, it has chosen
Сегодня, как
radically,
и
and
20
it
лет
has
назад,
changed radically, and it is continuing to change. But
главное не
today,
ошибиться
just like 20 years ago,
в принимаемых
it is
решениях.
extremely important
В
not
анализе и
to
оценках
make a mistake
основных
in
тенденций,
evaluating
которые
the
мы
situation,
наблюдаем.
in evaluating the main trends with which we
В чем
are
я вижу
dealing.
главные особенности современного мира?
What are the principal
Его
characteristics
отличия
of the
от
world today? What
недавнего, но
are
уже пройденного
the
исторического
distinctions, the
этапа?
differences of the world today from the
Это
past stage in
противоречивый
history,
мир.
from the recent stage in history? This
Но
world
прежде всего
today
мы наблюдаем,
is very
что это
contradictory,
прежде всего
but we see
высокий
that
уровень все-таки
today, above all,
взаимозависимости. Все то,
the
что
extremely high level
принято
of
называть глобализацией.
interdependence, what we
В
call
то же время
globalization.
невключенность в этот
But at the same
процесс
time, we
целых
see that
миллиардов народов.
billions of people are excluded from this process of globalization.
Это подъем новых центров
We also see the
экономического и
rise
политического
of new
влияния.
centers of economic and
Все более
political
уверенный
influence.
выход на
We see
мировую
the
арену
emergence,
таких
the confident
гигантов, как
emergence
Китай,
in the international
Индия,
scene
Бразилия.
of giants, the new giants such as
Это все
China,
нам
India,
предстоит
and
осмыслить и
Brazil.
понять.
we have to
Это
give
особая
a
роль
lot of thought
Соединенных
to
Штатов,
this fact. We
оказавшейся в
also
роли
see the special
единственной
role of the
сверхдержавы.
United States, which today is the only
Это появление
superpower.
в качестве
We also see the
важнейшего
emergence
позитивного
as
фактора
the most important
объединяющейся и
positive factor,
расширяющейся Европы.
Europe, which is uniting and which
Это
is
демократический
expanding.
транзит России и
We
всего
see the
постсоветского
democratic
пространства.
transition of Russia
целом,
and other former Soviet
демократические процессы,
republics, and
охватившие
generally the
мир.
democratic process
Это,
that is
наконец,
spreading throughout the
адаптирующийся
world.
к вызовам
And finally, we see the
современности
process of
исламский
adjustment of the Islamic world to the challenges
Проблемы
of the
этого
new age.
процесса
The problems
должны
inherent in this process
вызвать у нас заботу и внимание, и уважение.
must cause both attention, interest, concern,
Даже то, что я
and
сказал,
respect.
все это говорит, что
What I've
этот
just listed
мир, в котором мы
I believe,
уже живем,
demonstrates that the world in which we are living,
в которое
the world
человечество ищет ответы на
in
главные
which
вопросы 21
mankind
века,
is looking for
вызов
answers
безопасности,
to the main challenges of the 21st century,
вызов бедности и
the
отсталости,
challenge of security, the challenge
вызов
of
глобального
poverty and
экологического
backwardness,
кризиса.
and the challenge of the global
В середине
environmental crisis.
80-х годов
In the mid-1980s,
мы видели главную
We
задачу и высший
regarded as
приоритет
our
видели
main
в
task
том,
and
чтобы
our highest priority
прекратить ядерный
the
не
ending
допустить ядерный конфликт
of the
и
arms race and
прекратить гонку
preventing
вооружений.
a nuclear conflict.
Мы предложили новое
That's why
мышление, как
we
альтернативу
proposed new
старым
thinking
подходам.
as an alternative to
И
old
эта
approaches.
задача была общими
And,
усилиями решена.
Through common efforts, we
Новое мышление
accomplished
не было
that task. The new
озарением,
thinking was not some kind
возникшим
of
на пустом месте
revelation
из ничего.
that came out of nowhere.
Оно сохраняло
The new
преемственность
thinking was
с важнейшими
consistent
принципами международного права и
with
международного
the
государства.
main principles of
Думаю,
international
что
law,
сегодня нам
and
необходимо
I believe that
новое
today
мышление
we
для
need
нового века.
new thinking for a new
Оно должно
century.
питать в себя все
It
ценное
should
в наследии
absorb
20 века.
all that
И
is
в то же
valuable
время
in the
учесть
legacy of the 20th
изменения,
century, and
проблемы,
at the same time take into
которые
account
с которыми мы
the
столкнулись
changes and the
на рубеже
problems
веков,
that we are
те
facing
главные особенности
at the turn of the
нынешнего
century,
этапа в
the
развитии
main
мира,
trends
которые я только что
in the
перечислял.
current stage of global development that I've just listed.
Я, конечно, далек от того, чтобы
I'm very
претендовать
far
на
from
изложение, на
claiming the
формулирование во всей
right
полноте
to formulate fully
современный вариант
the
нового
new
мышления.
version of the new thinking.
В моем возрасте такие
In my
вещи уже не
age,
делают.
one doesn't make such claims.
Все же он обязывает быть серьезным.
One has to be serious.
Тем более и тема наша
And
весьма
the
серьезная.
subject that we are discussing
некоторыми
is very
размышлениями
serious.
на
But
этот
let me
счет
share
хочу
with
поделиться.
you some thoughts in this regard.
Глобализация.
Globalization.
Да, она объективна и неизбежна.
Globalization is an objective and inevitable process.
Но пока миллиарды
But
от нее
whereas
или ничего,
billions
или
of
почти,
people
или мало
have
что получили.
benefited in a very small way or
Миру
in no way at
грозят
all
серьезные
from globalization,
потрясения, если
the world
эта
is
тенденция
facing
возобладает
the
до
risk
конца.
of great upheaval
Если мы
if this continues.
Не вмешаемся в этот
If we
стихийный
do not
процесс.
do something to adjust this process.
Надо прислушаться к тем,
We should listen to those
кто выступает за глобализацию с человеческим лицом.
is speaking about the need for a globalization with a human face.
И попытаться
We should
разглядеть
try to
зерно
see the
в
grain
этих
of
протестных требованиях.
truth in the protests against globalization.
Они считают, что иной мир возможен.
The people who are protesting believe that a different world is
Я такого
possible,
же мнения.
and I agree with them.
Новые центры силы,
The new power centers
они должны стать
should become
ответственной частью
a
мирового
responsible part
сообщества.
of the global community.
В отношениях с ними
In
недопустимы
relations with them, I believe it's totally unacceptable to take a confrontational approach, to try to isolate them or to play geopolitical
Мне
games.
кажется,
I
что сейчас
think
особенно мы сложный
that
этап
right now
происходим.
we are
И если
going
кто-то
through
будет
a
разыгрывать эти
particularly
карты,
complicated stage, and if anyone tried to play such geopolitical games, that would push us back into the past, that would push us back again toward the division of the world. Now, about the role of the United States, America has a right to be a leader because of its power, because of its democratic traditions, because of its cultural and economic influence in the world. But this leadership should be realized through partnership rather than through domination. I believe that the years after the end of the Cold War should have persuaded us that this is indeed so. Certain experiments that we saw, I believe, have shown that domination is not acceptable. Now, about uniting Europe, we should fully recognize its positive potential. We should reject any attempt to divide Europe into old Europe and new Europe. Europe itself should find an optimum pace of integration, and the optimum model of building a greater Europe. I believe that a greater Europe should be built not only on the basis of the European Union, not only from the West, but also from the East, because we do see in the East an attempt to create a new integration based on recognizing the sovereignty of the newly independent states. The democratic transition of Russia and other countries have turned out to be more difficult, more complicated than many people thought. Well, let us trust the new democracies. Those new democracies have covered only half the road, and if you evaluate them from the standpoint of the advanced democracies, well, you can do a lot of harm and make the situation more complicated. I remember on one of my visits to the United States of America, people asked me, why is it that democracy in Russia is not doing as well as it should? And I said, well, I agree. We have not yet fully succeeded. But maybe you think that we're too talented. We are talented, and probably more talented than Americans, but not that much. Because, after all, it took you 200 years to build the kind of democracy that you have in your country, and you want us to succeed in just 200 days in a country like Russia, which is a world of many different cultures, where all religions are represented, where people speak so many languages. In the Soviet Union, people spoke 240 languages and dialects. A country that spans 9.5 time zones. Well, I stop listing those things about Russia. I don't want to scare you. I want you to visit Russia, to come to Russia with business and with tourism. All of this means that we should build a democratic country, a democratic state, while taking into account all of those Russian realities. Democracy cannot be imposed by missiles or tanks. Democracy should mature from the soil of nations, and helping the democratic process. This is the way to go, and I believe this will be appreciated by the people who are building democracy, and I think this will be very satisfying work. Now, about the Islamic world. The Islamic world deserves respect and understanding. It is maturing. Conditions are maturing for adaptation of this world to a rapidly changing world. The Islamic world has tremendous potential. During 1,500 years, it has enriched the world's culture and science. So an equal
и равноуважительный диалог
and equally respectful dialogue with the Islamic world is not only possible, this is the only way to go, and this is what is necessary.
Сегодня мы имеем новую картину
Today
мира.
we are facing a different world,
В этом
a
контексте
new picture of the
возникает
world. In this
настоятельная
context,
необходимость
I believe
переосмысления
it is
и роли
necessary
Запада
to
в
rethink
целом
the
глобальных
role
процессах.
of the West in the global process.
Размышляя над нынешним
Thinking about
состоянием
the
мира, я
current
прихожу к выводу
situation in the world,
о
I
необходимости
conclude
срочных
that
действий,
there is a
объединения
need to take
усилий
urgent
перед лицом
steps
глобальных
to
вызовов.
unite the efforts of all of us in the face
Главное,
of the global challenges.
с чего нам, видимо,
The
надо
most important
начинать,
thing that
кстати,
we
в
should
истории
start,
всегда так
and I believe
происходило,
that this is the way
это
it always was in
преодоление
history,
инерции в
is to
состоянии умов,
overcome the inertia in our
политике,
minds, the inertia in
управлении,
politics,
в методах
in
ведения
government, in the methods
Нам до
that we
крайности
use.
нужны
We
новая мировая
need
политика и
new
политическая
world
воля.
politics, and we
Вы
need
посмотрите, что
political
происходит.
will.
Происходят форумы по воде,
We see that
происходит Киотский
conferences are held,
протокол, Рио-де-Жанейро и
Kyoto
много-много другое.
Protocol
Все повисает.
has been signed,
Теперь
decisions
декларации
about water resources were taken,
Тысячелетия только что приняты,
and
взяты,
all of
на
this is
высшем
not
уровне
being
подписаны.
implemented. The Millennium
происходит
Development
сейчас?
Goals, the Millennium
Уже
Declaration,
понадобилась конференция в этом году для того, чтобы
see what's
посмотреть,
happening with that. There was a
вот
conference
выполнение
last
этих
September
обязательств, которые
in order
внушают большие
to consider the implementation
Значит, у нас
of those
огромный
pledges, and
разрыв
we are
между
worried that
словом и
they're
делом.
not being
Нет
implemented.
политической
There is a
воли.
tremendous gap between
Нам
words
нужны
and
поэтому
deeds. There is a lack of political will,
новая
and
мировая
that's why
политика
we
и
need
политическая
a new
воля,
kind of global
адекватная
politics
вызовам
and the
современного
political
глобального
will
мира.
which is consistent with the
Нам
challenges
нужен
that the
своего
world
рода
is facing.
глобальный
I believe
договор
that we need a kind
о
of
принципах
global
нового мирового
compact
порядка,
about the
которые
principles
бы
of
стали
the new
основой
world order
жизни народов
that
при сохранении
will become the
многообразия
basis
мира, и этнического,
for
и культурного.
nations, while those nations will also preserve
Последняя
their ethnic and cultural
Генеральная Ассамблея
diversity.
показала,
The recent UN General Assembly
что
session
пока
has
что
shown
мировое
that
сообщество не
at this
располагает
time, the international community does not have the effective tools for addressing the urgent problems, particularly the problems of poverty and backwardness. I believe that
в его
the first
создании
steps should be
направить
taken in building such tools and specifically to implement the obligation about allocating 0.7% of the GDP to fight poverty. I believe,
Наверное, президент Клинтон
I think
устал
that
от
President Clinton
ожидания, когда это свершится,
is
потому что только 3-4
probably
страны у нас
waiting for this to
в этом
happen,
объеме
but only 3 or 4 countries in the world have allocated that percentage. President Clinton is working hard today to help fight poverty and to bring the resources and the help of people to address those problems. This is important, but I believe that we need an international mechanism to address this task. We should also start building a better global governance on the basis of international cooperation, international law, on the basis of existing international organizations. This should be done at the national level, at the regional level, and at the international level. And what is most important is the real reform of the United Nations.
От того, что создаются все больше проклятий, от того, что кто-то собирается
The
лишить
vilification of the
от того,
United
что
Nations,
она не
the
устраивает
threats
кого-то.
not to
Я должен
finance
сказать,
that
мало что
organization.
меняется. Это
Well, that is not
констатация,
helpful.
вообще
That
говоря,
doesn't
демонстрация
change
бессилия
anything for the
мирового
better.
сообщества.
That shows the
Нужна нам ООН. Мы
powerlessness
без нее не
of the
обойдемся.
international community.
Вся эта
We need the
система,
United
национальный,
Nations.
региональный,
We
международный
need
уровень
the
и
entire
на
system
вершине Организации
of
Объединенных
organizations
Наций.
at all
Эта система
levels
может, функционируя,
with the United Nations at the top of that
управляемость
system.
в
This
мире.
can
Ни о каком
make the
правительстве,
world
мировом
more
правительстве
governable. Of
речи
course,
не может
I'm
быть.
not
Ни о
talking
какой
about
команде из
a
любого
global
угла.
government.
Не
I'm not
может быть речи.
talking
Это
about
всё
world
иллюзии,
government that
и
issues
надо их
orders and
отбросить.
commands. That would be an
И
illusion.
надо идти по пути
We should go forward
реформирования ООН.
by reforming the United Nations.
Что касается решения решения этих проблем, то, мне кажется,
I believe that when we speak about solving those problems, we have to recognize that we are still stuck in the old times and in old politics. The sooner we pull ourselves out of that, the better. We should take risks. If we don't take risks, I believe that we'll continue to lag behind the events. So we need to act urgently in the face of these global challenges.
Мне думается, что для разработки новой стратегии
I think that in order to develop this new strategy and to shape the political will that we need in this global world,
мы перед лицом этих проблем должны понять необходимость
should understand
сотрудничества.
the need to interact, the need to cooperate. There is still
Подбрасываем темы,
too much that is weighing us down
поссорить, столкнуть какие-то страны
from the
по
past.
каким-то
People
частным
are
выгодам.
trying to cause conflicts between countries and are trying to benefit from such conflicts. But I believe that in order to, if we address the big problems, I believe then we will also be able to solve smaller problems and assure our security and make sure that the world does not face the threat and various explosions. There is understanding in the world about the need to move toward a truly new world order, and we need leadership for this. And I believe that if we understand that leadership is necessary, leadership will emerge. This is the way it always happened. So I'm convinced that we must find a way to work together. The more time is wasted, the more we lose. What kind of world should we try to build? Let me quote President John Kennedy, speaking on June 10th, 1963, in American University in Washington. He said, the most important subject is the subject of peace. What kind of peace am I speaking of? What kind of peace do we want? It's not the Pax Americana imposed by weapons of war. It is not the peace of the grave and not the safety of a slave. I speak about real peace, a peace for which one lives, a peace that gives a chance to every individual, to every nation, to grow, to hope, to build a better life for their children. This is a world and the peace not just for Americans, but for all people. A peace not only for today, but also for tomorrow. Let me continue to quote John Kennedy. A true peace must be the result of the work of many nations, a sum of many efforts. It must be dynamic and not static. It must change in order to respond to the challenges of new generations, because peace is a process. Peace is a way to address problems. So I believe that the current situation is similar in importance to the times of John Kennedy, and we need new politics, we need new responsibility. And finally, another quote from John F. Kennedy.
Слова Джона Кеннеди о том, что общество
He said, a society
неспособное позаботиться о неимущем большинстве
cannot
своих
care
сограждан
for a poor majority
никогда не сможет
of its
защитить
citizens
и тех,
will never
кто
be able
преуспевает.
to protect those who
Думаю,
are
сегодня эта
wealthy.
мысль
I believe
полностью применима
that today
и в глобальном
this
масштабе.
thought should be
Будущее может быть
expanded
только общим для всех,
globally.
или его
Our
вообще
future will be common, a common future or no future at all.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Whether in the Middle East, Russia and the former Soviet republics, Vietnam, China, Ireland, Bosnia, Africa, throughout the world, and today in tsunami and Katrina relief efforts, a true and consistent leader, a champion of change, is the 42nd President of the United States. Please welcome President William Jefferson Clinton.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, President Gorbachev, Irina, Secretary Powell, Secretary Albright, Secretary Carlucci, Secretary Kemp, members of Congress, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. I am profoundly honored to be here. You know, in 1985, I was, in the immortal words of my predecessor, just the governor of a small southern state who had loved Russia from afar and longed for some rapprochement with the Soviet Union. I first went there when I was 23 years old, on New Year's Eve, 1969 and 70. I went again, Mr. President, in 1990, shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall and shortly before the August coup attempt. Those of us who are old enough to remember exactly where we were 20 years ago and who were old enough at that time to have been interested in public life will know that President Gorbachev was altogether too modest in his recounting of what happened in that moment and what its impact on all the world was. For it was obvious from the beginning that when perestroika bloomed in Russia, when there was a new openness, a new sense of freedom, there was also a new kind of leader, a person who was strong without being overbearing, a person who wore his power with grace and good humor, who seemed to genuinely enjoy and trust his fellow citizens and those with whom he had to deal around the world. Fundamentally, perestroika was meant to benefit the people of the former Soviet Union. But in the end, it did lead to glasnost, to the remarkable meeting with President Reagan at Reykjavik, when two men across what had once been thought to be an unreachable divide actually contemplated the end of the nuclear era. And it led, as we all know, to the end of the Cold War. Mr. President, you will go down in history as someone who changed the world for the better. And one of the most important figures in the entire world in the latter half of the 20th century. I always tell people that for every public servant, in the end, there are only three tests. Did you promote unity over division? Did you point the way to a brighter future? And were people better off because you served? The answer to all those three questions, as regards Mikhail Gorbachev, is a resounding yes, not only for his own people, but for all of us as well. As Ambassador Matlock said earlier tonight, both sides won the Cold War. One of the real reasons I'm here tonight is that I owe my presidency to Mikhail Gorbachev. And I say that advisedly because he was friends with all the other guys. But if he hadn't ended the Cold War, there is no way in the wide world a governor with no foreign policy experience could have been elected President of the United States of America. So I thank you, Mr. President. I've never been able to do that, and I wanted to thank you for that. I tried to honor your legacy during my service. Along with Secretary Albright and the rest of our foreign policy team, we did everything we could to make sure that Russia continued to grow in openness and freedom and positive influence. With financial assistance, political support, security cooperation, we're trying to bring Russia into the family of international organizations, every possible one. We supported the attempt to create a free economy and a more vibrant society. And some things I think that often get overlooked. 2/3 of the Russian economy is now privatized. In 1989, there were no non-governmental organizations. Today, there are over 63,000 NGOs in Russia. That is the triumph of Perestroika, too, the freedom of ordinary people. Just since 1993, there have been 40,000 citizen exchanges between Americans and Russians, and countless with others. One thing I learned in 1969 when I went to Russia, New Year's Eve, 69 and 70, I spent the first week of 1970 there. I was just 23. What did I know? I learned one thing, that there was a natural affinity between Americans and the people I met on the streets in Moscow. It was at a time of détente. The Russians had just watched the moon walk. People came up to me trying out their English. And I came home all those long years before you came to power, thinking that if only some political leader would liberate the people of Russia, and in the process liberate the people of my country to follow their hearts as well as their minds, we can make a whole new future for humankind together. That is what you did. You alluded to it, Mr. President. In recent years, some of the decisions of your country have raised questions in ours about whether they are completely faithful to your legacy. But I do believe, as you said, there is no way back. Not long ago, I took a trip on my AIDS work to Kazakhstan and to 5 cities in China, and on the way back, I had to refuel in eastern Russia. So I got out at this tiny airport in this small rural area, and the first thing I noticed was this really a rural area, this magnificent, truly beautiful statue of Lenin still standing under the trees. And standing in front of the statue of Lenin was the man who was supposed to take care of my airplane. He worked for a company based in Houston, Texas, and he had an American flag logo on his uniform. So I said to myself, Russia doesn't have to give up his past to build a new future. And it's going to be all right. It's going to be all right. President Gorbachev continues to use his influence in Russia and around the world to good effect. We had the great privilege not so very long ago of supporting an international environmental project to try to promote environmental awareness among children, and we did a recording of Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf, where Mikhail read the tale in Russia to the background of Prokofiev's music. And then there was a new version called The Wolf and Peter, which I read in English, where the grandchild of the original Peter goes out and captures a wolf and then lets it go because he realizes he was only able to effect the capture because the wolf's natural habitat had been destroyed. by people who didn't care about the environment. And so the child decides to choose the environment and species preservation just out of the goodness of his heart. Real reason Mikhail likes me is that we won a Grammy Award for that CD. One, I might add, that neither one of us had anything to do with it because the overall theme of the story was narrated by Sophia Loren. We just sort of hung along for the ride. Finally, let me say I support the analysis of world events and the prescription for their solution that President Gorbachev outlined tonight. We live in an interdependent world. We need a security system to fight terror and weapons of mass destruction. But we can't kill, jail, or occupy all of our enemies, so we've got to have a world where we try to build more friends and partners and fewer terrorists and enemies too. And when half the world tonight lives on less than $2 a day, and as we enjoy this sumptuous banquet, 1 billion people will go to bed hungry. When 1/4 of the world's people will die of AIDS, TB, malaria, or infections related to diarrhea because they never get clean water, we do well to heed the President's words. We have to build a world of shared benefits and shared responsibilities. I agree with what you said about Islam. We can agree with any people of any faith as long as nobody claims to be in possession of the absolute truth and the ability to turn that truth into a political program that they can impose on everybody else in the world. And I applaud what you said about climate change and the challenge of global warming. But most important, Mr. President, some of these problems will be solved by our successors. More and more will be solved by people in their private capacities. And all of us just about are in that capacity now. We've got to follow Ted Turner's lead and do what we can as private citizens. But the most important thing I want to say tonight is, for the rest of our lifetimes, whenever anyone in public or private life takes any step to open up a political society, to make people more free in sharing their ideas and more secure in sparking debate, to reach out across unbridgeable divides to people they once thought would be their enemies for life, to build a future that their children and grandchildren deserve, instead of one dictated by the bigotry and hatred and broken habits of older people. Whenever anyone steps out like that, they will be standing, sir, in a path that you blazed. Thank you, and God bless you.
Very eloquent and profound. Thank you, Mr. President. We're not trying to starve you all, so you can go ahead and enjoy your appetizer there. I'd like to recognize two distinguished congressional leaders who are with us. Senator Carl Levin and his wife Barbara. And Congressman James Moran and his wife Luann. Tonight we will be viewing an excerpt of the documentary Gorbachev's Revolution by director Fern Levitt and producer Alan Mendelson, who are here with us this evening. Fern's previous films include leading human rights activist Little Rock 9, Andrei Sakharov, and Václav Havel. Gorbachev's Revolution tells the story of President Gorbachev's dramatic rise to become the leader of the Soviet Union and the enormous impact his leadership has had on the entire world. During his leadership, President Gorbachev transformed the Soviet Union, ended the Cold War, and was responsible for the freedom of millions of people throughout the world. Gorbachev's Revolution has won several international awards, including this year's top prize at the U.S. International Film and Video Awards in Los Angeles. May I present Gorbachev's Revolution.
What he was able to do for the world and for Russia will go down in history is just remarkable.
Это могут быть срывы, болезни, спады, но мы будем меняться. Другого нет, товарищи. Другой путь этот спит. Мы должны сотрудничать по-человечески.
Gorbachev took his decisions on the basis of life rather than dogma. Gorbachev could take risks, and Gorbachev evolved. The most important thing about Gorbachev is that he evolved.
Это приходит со временем. Это не то, что какое-то озарение. Но вот с чего начиналось. И прожитая жизнь, университет, прожитая жизнь, почти полвека в политике, они привели меня к тому, что стало основой моей политики перестройки, моей позиции. Я бы сказал, реформаторской позиции. Но глубокой реформы, которую я по последствиям сравнивал с революцией.
December 1987, the leader of the Soviet Union and the President of the United States meet on the steps of the White House. A pivotal moment the world will never forget as the two former adversaries begin to end the arms race.
Our peoples, for too long, have been both the masters and the captives of a deadly arms race. This situation is not preordained and not part of some inevitable course of history.
Подобающими великой, миролюбивой державе. Благодарю вас.
On behalf of the Soviet people, I declare that we are prepared to go all the way along our part of the road with the sincerity and responsibility that befit a great and peaceful power. Thank you.
What motivated Gorbachev? I think world peace, changing the Soviet system to opening it up to more democracy, and the reduction of terror related to nuclear weapons, nuclear war. I think these were his objectives.
Succeeding generations will hand down their verdict on the importance of the event which we are about to witness. But I will venture to say that what we are going to do has a universal significance for mankind, both from the standpoint of world politics and from the standpoint of humanism.
December 1987. President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev signed the INF Treaty, the first and only international treaty forever eliminating an entire class of nuclear missiles.
Some of the arms agreements in the end actually reduced the nuclear arsenals, which nobody would have predicted in 1985. But they actually did reduce the arsenals, which was a stupendous achievement. But also they buried the Cold War at the bottom of the Mediterranean, which is also a tremendous step forward.
In 1989, Mikhail Gorbachev ends the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan and brings the troops home. This daring move represents another blow to the conservatives and military leaders who view this as a sign of weakness and another signal that their power is eroding.
Gorbachev took his decisions on the basis of life rather than dogma. Gorbachev could take risks, and Gorbachev evolved. The most important thing about Gorbachev is that he evolved.
Gorbachev takes the first steps toward free elections in his country by forming the Congress of People's Deputies, the first Soviet governing body where 1/2 of the seats are contested in the country's first elections.
В общем-то, я не затрагивал эти темы. Мы, в общем-то, все втянуты в мировой процесс. И в контексте этого мы должны себя видеть и понимать. Поэтому мы будем меняться. Мы будем меняться в Союзе. Мы будем меняться в Европе. Никто не сорвет.
Потому что, выйдя на путях развития демократических процессов и гласности, выйдя к тому, что мы начали демонтировать тоталитарную систему, покончили с монополией одной партии, вышли к политическому плюрализму, экономическому, признали инакомыслие, и, наконец, завершилось это самой мощной, свободными выборами.
Gorbachev presses ahead as the Communist Party is restructured. In 1990, the Congress amends Article 6, ending the Communist Party's monopoly of power. Multi-party elections are allowed for the first time in Soviet history. Gorbachev's reforms make headlines throughout the world, especially in Eastern Europe, where after years of Soviet control, the people believe they will finally be free.
Потому что, в конце концов, раз мы своему народу даем право выбора, и он выбирает путь демократии, движения к свободе, к рыночной экономике, спрашивается, разве мы можем другую занять позицию по отношению к нашим друзьям по Варшавскому договору?
I remember one key meeting in the White House. It was probably the turning point regarding the unification of Germany. And Gorbachev said, let the German people decide their future. I said, President, did I get you right now? You think that the Germans should have total self-determination. If they want to stay in NATO, they can do it. Warsaw Pact, yeah. And he said, absolutely. So that, I think, was probably as huge a historic moment as anything that happened in my presidency, because it led to the unification, and it led to the liberation of Eastern Europe, and it led to it all being done in peace.
God, please hear us, listen to our prayer, and help us to thy will upon this earth. Let the children suffer war no more, and let a peaceful world be given birth. Every hand that holds a sword can hold a baby. Every heart.
He was a man who was really alive, and he had a message which everyone wanted to believe. Let's live in peace. Let's work together. Everyone wanted to hear that. It's an extraordinary phenomenon. A Soviet leader, a Russian leader, for the first time in his history, becoming a world leader.
He was a humane man, and that ensured that the changes went ahead and that communism was brought to a peaceful end.
Mikhail Gorbachev becomes a worldwide sensation. Crowds cheer his name as the world becomes infused with Gorby mania. In October 1990, he is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, the first and only Soviet leader to be recognized by the world for his courage and humanity.
No world can change unless attention is focused on opportunity and leadership for youth. General Colin Powell, former Secretary of State, has made that commitment with the establishment of America's Promise Alliance for Youth. Please welcome one of America's great leaders at home and abroad, General Colin Powell.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much. President Gorbachev, President Clinton, Secretary Albright, Secretary Carlucci, Secretary Kemp, Ambassador Matlock, so many other distinguished guests. I cannot tell you how honored I am to be here this evening, and I am here in a somewhat different capacity than most of you who are present this evening. I'm not an intellectual, and I wasn't at the time of Perestroika's beginning in 1985. I wasn't a diplomat. I wasn't an academic. I was an infantry officer. And there I was in 1985 as a Major General, Infantry, United States Army. And suddenly a new Russian leader came on the scene, but I assumed he was like all previous Russian leaders in my career of military service to that point. And what I was getting ready to do was to go to Germany for my second assignment in Germany, to be a Corps commander this time. I had been a lieutenant in Germany many years before, but the mission hadn't changed over the 28 years between the time I was a lieutenant and now as a Corps commander. And I went back to the very same place, the Fulda Gap. And my mission was very clear. This was the strategy of containment. The Russians were on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and they were the potential enemy. And my job was to contain that Soviet menace as we saw it. There was consistency over all those decades of the Cold War. And now, as a three-star Corps commander, I was going to continue to play my part in the strategy of containment. And the Russians were supposed to follow the script. They were supposed to always show hostility toward the West. They were supposed to have a general secretary of the Communist Party who captured that previous philosophy of earlier general secretaries. And suddenly, the script was changed, and on to the scene came Mr. Gorbachev. And Mr. Gorbachev was saying things that were so inconsistent with what we had heard from previous Soviet leaders. He talked about glasnost, openness, allowing information to cross this physical boundary, the Iron Curtain, information that we knew and he knew was more powerful than any military force that could cross the Iron Curtain. And then he started talking about perestroika, restructuring. He was going to restructure his political system and his economic system. and other systems within the Soviet Union because they were not working, they were not up to the challenges that the Soviet people, the Russian people, were facing as we began the end of the 20th century and entered the 21st century. But nevertheless, I was a corps commander doing my job, the strategy of containment. I couldn't be deterred or changed from my mission by nice political statements with respect to glasnost and perestroika. And then suddenly I was no longer a corps commander. I was brought back into the White House to work with my dear friend Frank Carlucci, Secretary Carlucci, who is here tonight and was National Security Advisor to President Reagan, and I was his deputy. And then Frank went to the Department of Defense and I became National Security Advisor. And I was with President Reagan and Secretary of State Shultz and Secretary Carlucci as we dealt with this new Russian leader and his rather bold visionary ideas. I was there and helped negotiate, as did Frank, the INF Treaty that you saw signed and the instruments of ratification exchanged between the two presidents. But nevertheless, I wasn't going to lose my understanding of the nature of that regime. I was a soldier, and I would not let my guard down. And then in 1988, I went to Moscow with Secretary of State Shultz to visit once more with President Gorbachev. And we went just before President Reagan was scheduled to visit the Soviet Union for the first time. President Reagan finally was going to visit what he had characterized as the evil empire. And in this preparatory meeting, we sat in the Hall of St. Catherine across the table from President Gorbachev, and President Gorbachev, in that wonderful animated way that he has, that you saw tonight and you saw so vividly on the video, was going after Shultz and myself. Look at what I am doing. I am doing things you never would have imagined. I'm serious, and I'm going to follow this road wherever it takes me to the end. And I listened carefully, but with a level of suspicion and sarcasm, because I was a soldier and my whole career had been predicated on this evil empire, an empire that wasn't going to change. From my early days as a soldier to the time I first went to the Soviet Union and crossed the Soviet Union on the Trans-Siberian Express, I wasn't going to be suddenly be deceived by a new Russian leader who spoke nice things and was just starting to move down this road of perestroika and glasnost. So I'm sure at that meeting I must have communicated to something to President Gorbachev that got his attention. He could see the look of concern and suspicion on my face, and so he stopped in the middle of his discussion with us about how we had to help him with perestroika and glasnost. He could see the suspicion on my face, and he stopped and he looked at me. And then he turned away and he looked up and collected his thoughts for a moment. And then I'll never forget President Gorbachev looking back down across the table. He caught my eyes in his eyes. He leaned forward. He had a nice little smile on his face. And he said to me, Generale, I'm very, very sorry. You're going to have to find a new enemy. I thought to myself in that moment, I don't want to. I'm very comfortable with this enemy. Just because you think you have to change, why do I have to? But what President Gorbachev was doing was not just changing the Soviet Union. He was changing the world. As you heard mentioned earlier, he was not just a leader of the Soviet Union. He was now on the world stage. He was going to be a leader of the world. And he was bringing a Cold War to the end because the Soviets needed the Cold War to come to an end. They needed to get rid of this arms race. They needed to get rid of this state of enmity with the United States and with Western Europe and with the rest of the world. They needed rapprochement in so many different ways. It was obvious. It had been obvious for years. But what makes this man unique and what makes this man great is the fact that he looked that reality straight in the face and he didn't turn away. Earlier leaders of the Soviet Union must have known these problems existed and something had to be done, but they did nothing. It took a man of President Gorbachev's intellect, his stature, his personality, his charisma, his strength of character, his moral strength, his physical strength. It took a man such as him to look this reality straight in the face and say to the people of the Soviet Union, the people of Russia, we must change, we must move, and there is no other way, let's move forward. And they did, and he did. It didn't turn out exactly the way he had hoped, but nevertheless, he put Russia on a path that is moving forward into the future. There is no going back. There will be no return to the days of enmity. The Iron Curtain is gone, the Cold War is gone. Europe is increasingly whole, free, and at peace. And we watch as new Russian leaders, Mr. Yeltsin and now Mr. Putin, move forward. And we have disagreements with some of the things they are doing, but nevertheless, we must understand that they're not going backwards. They're finding their way forward, and they have to find their way forward, and we can help them, and we will help them. And so this gentleman who we recognize tonight will go into the history books as a man of enormous vision, a man of enormous courage, a man who saw reality and did not turn from the demands of reality. He did not shrink. He did not show fear. He knew what had to be done, and he did it. And as a result of his service to his country and to the world is a better place. And he continues his service in the aftermath of his presidency, working toward a cleaner environment, working toward climate change, working toward relieving suffering around the world, working toward making the Russian Federation a better place, but more importantly, making the world a better place. And so we come to thank him once again, to congratulate him for his service. And Mr. President, I just want to let you know that I am uniquely honored to be here this evening to say these words to you, and above all, to call you my friend. Thank you, sir.
General Powell, thank you, sir. I want to congratulate all of you. This is the largest, most silent group of eaters I've ever witnessed in the history of banquets. Fern and Alan, thank you again for that wonderful documentary. There is simply no way to have a discussion about change in the 20th century without recognizing the incredible impact of CNN. Inaugurated in 1980 by our next speaker. Please welcome a truly renowned world change leader, and a fact you may not know, but I'm sure he won't mind the plug, the owner of Ted's Montana Grill, Mr. Ted Turner.
Thank you. It is, what a night. What a night. What a night. This is, I can't ever remember having such a happy occasion. And really, it says perestroika, but what this is a tribute to you, President Gorbachev, and the people that helped you. I mean, without Ronald Reagan and George Bush, without their help, without the help of many, many others, you couldn't have done it, and you got a lot of help, thankfully. But you were the main one, and you deserve the main glory. I was there. When I started CNN in 1980, even before I started, I said, what am I going to do with CNN? What's going to be the objective for CNN? And I said, I want CNN to make the world better. I think through information, you can do more than just run stories about who the pervert of the day is. You can do important, thoughtful stories, and you can cover things that are important. And so I wanted CNN to stand for something. And I said, what are the problems that face the world today? Well, clearly the biggest problem back in 78, 79, when I was planning CNN, the biggest problem by far was the Cold War and the danger of a nuclear annihilation. And so I said, well, the first thing I'm going to do when CNN gets on the air in June of 1980 is I'm going to go see if what I can do to stop the Cold War. So in 1982, I went to Cuba and met Castro. He had invited me down because he was watching CNN. He said, "You've really got something here, Ted. You know, world leaders need it." I said, well, I'm going to take it all over the world anyway. We're planning for CNN International. And by 1983, I was already in Moscow. And already they had boycotted, already the United States under President Carter had boycotted the 1980 Olympic Games in Russia. And the 1984 games were slated to be in Moscow. And when I got there, the main thing that everybody wanted to talk about, the leaders I met with, I was involved in sports and news, the television and sports people, and some of the government people that I met. Gorby wasn't the head of the Soviet Union yet. It was Andropov, and he was sick, and I didn't get to meet him. He was ill. But what they were worried about and what they were thinking about is whether they should boycott the 1984 Olympic Games in Los Angeles. And I begged them, I said, please don't boycott the Games. Just because we boycotted and ruined your Olympics is no reason why you ought to ruin ours. And, but I couldn't talk them out of it. So in '84, they boycotted the Olympics. We'd had 2 boycotts of the Olympics. And I went back over there right after that, and I said, we've got to do something to stop this, because the next Olympics were slated for South Korea, which was an enemy at the time of the Soviet Union, and didn't even have diplomatic relations, because they were backing North Korea, we were backing South Korea. It was a very, very politically charged selection to pick South Korea, particularly after the dual boycott. So talking with the Soviet people, leaders in sport and television, we came up with the idea for the Goodwill Games to get the American and Soviet athletes back on the playing field so that we would avoid getting on the battlefield. And it really worked, and that's when I met President Gorbachev for the first time. I met him a couple of days before the Goodwill Games started. He was going to do the opening ceremonies there in Moscow and make a speech, which he made a wonderful, very conciliatory speech. We spent an hour together in his office, and we talked about what we could do to bring the world together. And it was just, I know you remember, we had a great time. Well, anyway, I kept working. I sent my son to live in Moscow. He lived there for 2 years and worked in our little bureau there. At one time, when we started, we only had 3 people there covering the Soviet Union, but it was bigger than, it was the same size as the bureaus of ABC, CBS, and NBC. And I went back and forth with lots of different other television projects and projects that we worked on together. The next Goodwill Games came to Seattle in 1990. Then they went back to St. Petersburg in 1994. So I was there during all of Perestroika. I was there, and I just was thinking, this is the greatest thing. And I've already said I want to thank President Reagan and President Bush for the side that they did. Now, I want to put it in perspective. I'm a student of history, and I'm going to say right here and now that I was very disappointed when Time picked Albert Einstein as the man of the century. They had earlier picked President Gorbachev. I like to call him Gorby myself, but President Gorbachev was picked as the man of the decade. But you, sir, were the man of the century, of the 20th century. You. Now, this is just one man's opinion, but it's a man's opinion of very careful thought and study. You, sir, were the man for all time in human history. Nobody made a bigger impact on this world and did more to save humanity from destruction. You are up there with Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, and Mahatma Gandhi, and if we had to pick anybody that was #1 in the whole world in history, it is you, sir. Come on. Now, The job that President Gorbachev and President Reagan started, the goal of nuclear disarmament, has not yet been met. The Russians and the Americans, even though we're not at war, Mr. Ambassador, normally we're not enemies anymore, we're friends. We still have the weapons on hair trigger alert. Let us resolve. Everybody in here is a person of goodwill or you wouldn't have been invited. Let us resolve to go back and finish the job and de-arm this world from nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons as soon as we can, so that humanity and our grandchildren can have a chance to have the kind of lives that we've had. Thank you very much.
Ted Turner, ladies and gentlemen, not running for office. Just telling it like it is. The mission of the Frank Foundation is to enhance the lives of children at risk throughout the world. A true advocate of this mission and a compassionate partner of the Foundation is Nobel Peace Prize winner Betty Williams. Betty was awarded her Nobel Peace Prize for her work against violence in her native Northern Ireland in 1976. She is currently president of the World Centers of Compassion for Children. Please welcome Betty Williams.
Hello, everybody. Well, now, the first thing I want you all to do is please stand up. Please, even presidents can stand up. Now give each other a hug. Please. Now, as you will notice, I'm wearing my sparkly shoes. Those are in honor of my grandbaby, who said, Grandmother, you're going to meet a lot of famous people, and you'll be awful nervous. So I suggest you wear your sparkly shoes. Do you know something? As I look around this room, I wonder whether I should bow, curtsy, genuflect, or salute. The English would say, my lords, ladies, and gentlemen, welcome to this party in honor of a great man. My introduction is Mr. President, and if there happens to be a president in this room that I've missed, I sincerely apologize. This is an incredible event, my friend. It's a really incredible, historic, beautiful, wonderful, loving, giving event. Never in my life have I ever would have the honor to meet someone who has changed world history. I wrote this speech, by the way, which I'm not very good at reading. In my native tongue, I would say to you, Cé míle fáilte adas ó húlaí, which means very welcome to this party. As I look around this room, I see the faces of many famous people, but it's not the Oscar Awards, so I'd not mention any names, except, of course, Shirley MacLaine, whom I adore. Shirley. Among us peace laureates, there are laureates and there are super laureates. There are those of us in our own small way who may have changed just one wee corner of our world, and then there are those of us who will have changed world history. My beloved friend, Mikhail Gorbachev, is one such man. On May the 30th, when he walked around the city of New York, I was sitting beside my father. My father, by the way, was an extremely pragmatic Irishman. And he looked at me and he said, when the tears were streaming and you were out on the street shaking the hands of New Yorkers, my father said, "Darling, do you realize this is something you will never see again? This is the like of what you will never see again. That is one brave and good man." And you know, Mr. President, I have never seen the like again. I have never seen a man who walks as tall as you in a spirit and with a soul. I have never in my life met a man more caring and devoted to changing what's wrong in our world. And you must recognize, Mr. President, that in your world, a person in your world, I'm sorry, a person in your world is never recognized in their own country. We all recognize that heroes are never recognized in their own country. But how could I have known that one day I would meet you, and one day I would have the honor not just to hug you, but love you as a friend. My organization, World Centers of Compassion for Children International, has made huge advances only through the Gorbachev Foundation. And tonight it gives me great pleasure to tell you all that we will be building the first Center of Compassion for Children, Cities of Compassion for Children. And we're going to do it because you helped us, Mr. President. You had the kindness, the dignity, the love, and also the commitment to my work to help me achieve that work. And on the 1st of November, we're going to the region of Piacenza in Italy to build the first City of Peace for Children, with the help of the Gorbachev Foundation. Now, to explain that to you, I know that everyone in this room hates long-winded, academic, intellectual lectures, and I'm not terribly good at giving them, as you will know. But we're starting to build cities for children, and the model city is being created in Basilicata, in the southern section of Italy. Now, to finish this speech, Mr. President, is only to tell you an Irish joke, because you and I have shared a lot of jokes around the table when we sat in Rome together, in the Campidoglio in Rome, which is magnificent. So I'll finish with an Irish joke, because I know you're all dying to leave by now with all these speeches, you know. I'll tell you the joke about two mothers in Ireland. One went to wake her son up for breakfast, and she gave him a wee shake on the shoulder. "Son, it's time to get up for breakfast." Oh, he said, "Mother, I can't." She said, "Well, you have to go to school now." He said, Mother, I can't go to school. There's no way I can go to school. She said then, give me 2 reasons why you shouldn't go to school. He said, first of all, I hate school, and all the pupils hate me too. God, son, that's no reason not to get up for breakfast. And the son said, well, Mother, give me 2 reasons why you should get up for breakfast, he said, Mother, first of all, you're 57 years old and you're the principal. I love you, Mr. President. God bless you.
Thank you, Betty. No one in the world today has had more impact on hope for youth and on change in the lives of disenfranchised and disadvantaged children of Russia and of the former Soviet Union than our host and chair this evening of this miraculous 20th anniversary celebration of Perestroika. Please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. Nina Kostina, President of the Frank Foundation and Child Assistance International.
Good evening. Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for coming today. It's a really beautiful evening, wonderful opportunity, fantastic company. I hope you enjoy the dinner, not only the speeches, but the dinner itself. And I will be very short. I would like to remember today the gentleman who was a very close friend of President Gorbachev and who recently passed away. A couple of days ago was his funeral, Alexander Yakovlev. And I'm afraid Pasha will help me to translate, because I will read what Alexander Yakovlev wrote about perestroika. He said, поистине великий вклад внесла перестройка в оздоровление мировой обстановки.
Perestroika was a great contribution in improving the international environment.
Начиная с 1989 года мы твердо встали на путь умиротворения.
Starting in 1985, we resolutely started a policy of peace.
Но афганская война еще продолжалась.
But the Afghan war was still continuing.
Лозунги об империализме, классовой борьбе и борьбе с буржуазной идеологией еще хрипели на митингах.
The slogans of fighting imperialism and fighting the bourgeois ideology were still held at rallies.
Иноземные компартии продолжали просить валюту на борьбу с капитализмом.
And foreign communist parties were still asking for money to fight capitalism.
Но шаг за шагом создавался образ новой страны.
But step by step we were shaping the image of a different country, of a new country.
Готовый к искреннему сотрудничеству.
That is ready for sincere cooperation.
По широкому фронту.
Along a broad front.
Мы заявили о нашем новом миропонимании.
We stated a new world view.
О целостном и взаимосвязанном мире.
And we stated that we believe that the world is interdependent and whole.
И он заканчивает этот небольшой параграф словами: «Теперь все смелые, а сколько их было тогда?»
And finally, Yakovlev says, today everyone is courageous, but how many courageous people were there at that time?
So I would like to propose this special toast to courageous people, to courageous men, to the President Michael Gorbachev.
Story.
There's an old hunter's saying that if you're grabbed by a croc, you should go for its eye. And this zebra must have heard it. The croc can dish it out, but apparently he can't take it. But if you think that story had a twist, wait till you see our next close encounter. It's the story of another crocodile and his victim, and the unbelievable behavior of an innocent bystander. These impala need to drink, and the younger animals haven't yet learned that the same waters that support life can also bring death. A young impala tries to cross the water, but then he's held fast in a crocodile's powerful jaws. In moments, the croc will drag him under. Nearby, a giant hippo looks on. Then, amazingly, it's driven the crocodile off. What follows is even more incredible. At first, it might look like the hippo wants to claim this meal for itself, but that's not what's happening. The hippo nuzzles the wounded impala, then takes its head in its mouth, not to eat it, but seemingly in an attempt to revive it. But it's no use. The crocodile has been patient. It emerges from the water and reclaims its prize. It's not just hippos that are willing to take on a crocodile. Baboons can't match the croc bite for bite, but they're fierce in their own right. When a crocodile seizes a baby baboon, the grown-ups don't take it lying down. In this instance, an angry male drives off the croc. But the rescue comes too late to save the baby. But in our most amazing moment, watch what happens in another life and death struggle between a young baboon and a hungry crocodile. Drought has drawn a group of baboons to a disappearing waterhole, where more than 100 camouflaged crocs lie in wait. In an instant, a youngster finds she's ventured too close. And this time, the adults can't or won't save her. If it were a hand or a foot, the baboon might sacrifice it and live, but that's not an option here. Then suddenly, she's free. Look again. Did the baboon claw the croc's eye? Or did her muddy fur slip the croc's grasp? We can't tell. But this baboon has literally snatched life from the jaws of death, with nothing but bad hair, and maybe a lifelong trauma to show for it. You've seen some extraordinary close encounters between animal adversaries, with unexpected twists and turns. You've witnessed other close encounters too. Shocks to the body that surprise and amaze us. Amazing food that really gets in your face. Wild encounters with some incredible creatures. And astonishing brushes with death that make us celebrate life. National Geographic's most amazing close encounters. Truly amazing.
Japan. One of the planes, the Enola Gay, is carrying a unique weapon more lethal than the combined payloads of hundreds of fully loaded bombers.
Tom, I got us about 2 minutes out.
Hi, I'm Hunter Ellis. In the summer of 1945, President Harry Truman authorizes the deployment of a weapon the likes of which mankind has never seen, a weapon that will transform the world. Its creator is a brilliant scientist striving to bring an end to World War II. But the bomb he creates has the power to not only end the war, but to also destroy humanity. In 1935, scientists discovered the neutron, the key to unlocking the secrets of atomic power.
It's a heavy isotope.
In 1938, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, two German chemists, split the nucleus of an atom into two smaller fragments with a neutron, a process they call fission.
Because it took very little energy going in, and this enormous amount comes out.
This enables the possibility that one fission, releasing neutrons, will trigger other fissions that release more neutrons, and you get double and double and double and double, and before you know it, most of the nuclei in the whole sample have exploded.
This remarkable discovery leads to the awareness that the energy released by these nuclei may be developed into a powerful new weapon.
But here in the United States, not too many people realize the potential of this discovery. Albert Einstein, however, did.
In 1939, Albert Einstein warns in a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt that the Nazis might try to split the atom and develop an extremely powerful bomb using nuclear fission. To beat them to this goal, President Roosevelt authorizes in 1941 what ultimately becomes a billion-dollar top-secret program, one with a name that is decidedly misleading.
The project to build the first atomic bomb was named the Manhattan Project to try to hide what it was, to make it clear this project had nothing at all to do with the atomic bomb, and it served its purpose.
After all, if Hitler gets a nuclear bomb before we do, and he alone has that kind of power, well, it's a very dangerous situation.
In late 1942, Los Alamos, New Mexico is selected as the site where the first atomic bomb will be designed and built. Its secluded location is key.
They needed some place that was not near any coast where the enemy would not be able to access it easily. They needed a remote place that was distant from any population.
April 1943. At the Manhattan Project's lab in Los Alamos, brilliant physicist Dr. Robert Oppenheimer and his team of scientists are in a race against time. Their task, transform the science of nuclear fission into a weapon of mass destruction.
Los Alamos scientists were working 6 days a week, 24 hours a day, night shifts, the kind of focused labor on one project, all to stop Hitler.
By 1945, World War II has scorched the planet for more than 5 years. Finally, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrenders. There's rejoicing in the streets, victory in Europe at last. But the war in the Pacific is far from over.
The Pacific War is, in some ways, more bloody and more difficult than the war in Europe had been. The Japanese, from island to island, fought down to the last man.
There's talk of a massive invasion of Japan by Allied forces to end the war, but the potential for tremendous casualties forces President Truman, the new commander-in-chief following President Roosevelt's death in April 1945, to turn to the most dreadful option. With pressure mounting to end the war in the Pacific, President Truman makes a momentous decision. He turns to the Manhattan Project and the destructive power of the atom bomb.
He was presented with this powerful weapon that could end the war by the military. At that point, I don't think there was much hesitation about using this against the Japanese.
July 1945, Los Alamos, New Mexico. History's most devastating weapon has been built, but before it can be used in combat, it must be tested. For the risky experiment, a secure and remote site is selected.
The Jornada del Muerta, the journey of the dead, the Spanish had called it, because it was so dry and barren desert that really you took your life into your hands crossing it in the old days.
The first test, scheduled for July 16, 1945, will be called Trinity. Some scientists are cautiously optimistic, while others worry about potentially catastrophic unknowns.
The physicists were terrified that it would be a dud. Then on the other end of the scale, if it worked, what if it worked too well? What if it was even larger than they imagined? What if it ignited the atmosphere?
If the nitrogen did fuse in the atmosphere, then the entire atmosphere would explode. It would be the end of life on Earth.
Despite the dangers, the test must go on.
Odds of it happening are very small. But until you do the calculation, that's the sort of thing you worry about.
The burden of a successful test explosion falls on one man, Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, the head of the Los Alamos Laboratory and visionary physicist behind the atomic bomb. The test is scheduled for 4 a.m., July 16, 1945. Just hours before the blast, scientists begin to arm the bomb, nicknamed the Gadget, which sits on a tower 100 feet high. But at 2 a.m., a rare desert thunderstorm threatens everything.
It was every physicist's worst nightmare.
As the storm intensifies, Oppenheimer and his team worry that lightning will trigger a detonation and kill the hundreds of people in the immediate area. 16th, 1945. The world's first atomic bomb, a massive 5-ton explosive, sits perched on a steel tower 100 feet above a vast uninhabited stretch of the New Mexico desert, waiting to be detonated at 4 a.m. Man, moment, and machine are fusing in history to forever alter the nature of war. The man in charge of the Trinity test, Robert Oppenheimer, needs the perfect conditions for the explosion, which will bring ever closer the moment, a deadly top-secret mission, a nuclear attack on Japan. The machine he's counting on is the atomic bomb, a devastating weapon that contains the power to destroy an entire city in seconds.
This is an explosion unlike anything that humans have ever done. It's worth thinking about. Unexpected consequences, what could happen? It's hard to figure out what they might be. You don't always get it right.
A thunderstorm threatens to set the bomb off early, potentially killing anyone within a few miles of the test site.
They were afraid that the electrical storms could trigger the Gadget. Again, how real those concerns were, nobody knew, because this was all new. And if you were down there, you were scared.
The test is rescheduled for 5:30 a.m. Early that morning, the storm passes without incident. At 5:10 a.m., the countdown begins. Scientists aren't sure if the bomb will be a dud or if it will succeed too well and bring about a cataclysmic event. But one thing is certain, the test must go forward. 5:29 a.m. In the command bunker nearly 6 miles from ground zero, Robert Oppenheimer anxiously watches and waits.
We get down to minus 10 seconds, minus 9, 8, 7. 6, 5, 4. And then suddenly, it's just like the sun suddenly appeared right in front of our eyes.
3, 2,
1. Smoke and dust, whatever, rising very rapidly, just shooting up towards the atmosphere. And sometime along the line, it got dim enough we took off our welder's glasses, and then it was bright daylight again. And
the bomb starts out at several million degrees in temperature. It's invisible for a few millionths of a second. It's generating X-rays, not visible light. The fireball has to cool down to 10,000 degrees before it's visible.
Some witnesses describe the intense blinding light as being brighter than daylight.
And they see this enormous fireball, and it's orange and purple and every color, and it's changing color, and it's gathering force.
The bomb yield is equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. Within seconds, a giant mushroom cloud, 5 miles high and visible for hundreds of miles, fills the New Mexico sky.
And then the blast wave hits and the sound hits, and there's this huge rumbling like thunder as the sound echoes all over this desert valley.
And about that time, everybody started cheering, realized that it really worked.
For Robert Oppenheimer, his creation is a brilliant success, but it also presents profound implications. The pressure affects Oppenheimer both psychologically and physically.
His weight at that point had dropped to 114 pounds, and people really worried about his health and his mental state.
Watching this thing occur feels like an enormous accomplishment, and it's balanced by the sense of dread of having created a weapon far more terrible than any weapon that's ever been created before, and this is not something scientists necessarily like to do.
What a handful of scientists and observers witnessed on July 16, 1945, is the dawn of the nuclear age. The massively destructive force of atomic power is now a genie out of the bottle and will play a critical role in the future course of World War II and international politics. Many say it couldn't have been done without the force of will of one man, Dr. Robert Oppenheimer. Born in New York City on April 22, 1904, Julius Robert Oppenheimer is raised in privileged surroundings.
Oppenheimer is protected as a child because a brother of his had died early in infancy of an infectious disease, and his mother was terribly afraid of letting him play in the streets.
As a young boy, Robert visits Central Park often, where he becomes passionate about collecting minerals. This love of science will stay with him for the rest of his life.
He's writing letters to the local geological society. They think he's an adult, and they invite him to give a lecture. And when this boy arrives, they're shocked, but delighted.
He was a prodigy. He was trained to believe by his father and then by his subsequent teachers that he was gifted, that he had this extraordinary potential.
In June of 1925, Oppenheimer graduates Harvard summa cum laude with a bachelor's degree in chemistry and travels to Europe to study theoretical physics. He works in Germany and the US on the individual behavior of the microscopic particles that make up all forms of matter: electrons, protons, and neutrons. His advancement of quantum theory establishes Oppenheimer as a leading theoretical physicist.
Oppenheimer didn't think that he had made the great contributions that he should have. He came back to the United States with this tremendous reputation. He was a great teacher, yet he was never satisfied with his accomplishments.
1929. After several difficult years in Europe, Oppenheimer accepts an unusual dual position teaching at Caltech and the University of California at Berkeley. His genius makes him many friends and admirers, but also enemies.
He didn't mind letting it be known that he was smarter than somebody else. Well, that didn't bother me because I knew he was. But some people can't take that.
While at Berkeley, Oppenheimer becomes involved in left-wing politics.
He went to communist functions. He participated in discussions, but he was not himself a member of the party.
September 17th, 1942. The Manhattan Project kicks into high gear. General Leslie Groves of the Army's Office of the Chief of Engineers is put in charge of the program. Groves recruits many scientists for the project, including J. Robert Oppenheimer, then only 38 years old.
The Manhattan Project is a very out-of-the-box project. It's something where you don't know how to get to the solution when you start out. You have to be open to every new idea. Oppenheimer excelled at that.
Doctor, are you on board? Count me in. Thank you.
Because of his ability to figure out and explain a problem with minimal information, Oppenheimer becomes the unquestioned leader of the group of scientists studying the concept of the bomb.
He took the enormous risk of a totally unproven, largely still theoretical technology, and it worked. But it was an enormous risk, and I don't think many people would have had the intellectual capacity to think through the problem at the beginning enough to take the risk.
By early May 1945, work on the atomic bomb is almost done. On May 11th, the Los Alamos Target Committee meets to select the site for the first nuclear attack.
Hiroshima is a good radar target, and a large part of the city could be extensively damaged.
There are also nearby hills, which are likely to produce a focusing effect, which would considerably increase the blast damage.
Hiroshima is the headquarters of the Japanese Second Army. With a population of 285,000 civilians and 43,000 soldiers, it is considered a prime target.
Hiroshima was one of the few cities in Japan that had not previously been bombed, so that afterwards we would be able to see the effect of the atomic bomb without being confused by previous damage.
July 16th, 1945. President Truman meets with allies Churchill and Stalin in Potsdam, Germany, to discuss post-war Europe. While there, he receives news of the successful Trinity test. He's also told that 2 nuclear bombs are nearly ready for combat drops over Japan.
It's extraordinary that these people put all this new technology together so quickly. And I think it's a measure of just how dreadful was their fear that someone else might beat us to the punch and drop one of these things on us.
July 26, 1945. U.S. military transport planes begin flying unassembled atom bomb components to Tinian Island in the Pacific. That same day, the Allies issue the Potsdam Declaration, which calls for Japan's immediate and unconditional surrender. The alternative is their prompt and utter destruction. July 8, 1945. The United States military is now in possession of 2 nuclear bombs, powerful explosives that may soon be used against the Japanese. Man, moment, and machine are rushing toward a devastating conclusion. The man whose genius has helped shape these lethal weapons is brilliant physicist Robert Oppenheimer. The moment is when his awe-inspiring creation will explode over a Japanese city. The machine is the atomic bomb, a weapon that is destined to change warfare forever.
Scientists don't like to create weapons. This weapon is what's necessary in order to win the war, a war against horrid adversaries.
The Japanese government rejects all terms for surrender. With the atomic bomb in hand, President Truman now believes he can finally bring an end to World War II.
There was the strategic questions. Was it wiser to use one atomic bomb than the saturation bombing that was currently being done over Japan, and in the sense achieving the same thing, only with much cruder and far more weapons?
The atomic bomb is unlike any other weapon. By splitting the atoms of heavy metals like uranium or plutonium, incredible amounts of energy are released, triggering an explosion of unprecedented proportion.
They had unleashed a force into the world that would change things forever. Nothing would ever be the same again.
When any nucleus explodes, it releases 1,000,000 times more energy than a typical chemical reaction. That way you release an energy which is perhaps 1,000,000 times as great as you would from an equal amount of dynamite or high explosive.
This is a good example of what happens during fission, when one neutron, symbolized by this superball, is introduced to unstable uranium-235 atoms represented by these mousetraps. The neutron acts as a detonator, starting a nuclear chain reaction that builds exponentially as each trap sets off more and more and more. The first bomb to be deployed is dubbed Little Boy. It is 10.5 feet long, weighs almost 5 tons, and has an explosive yield of 13.5 kilotons. That's the equivalent of 13,500 tons of TNT.
These were the biggest bombs that we knew how to make at that point in the history of nuclear weapons, but they were so small by modern standards that they would be considered tactical weapons today, minimal weapons today.
Little Boy is a gun-triggered fission bomb. A sphere of uranium-235 is made around the neutron generator, and a small bullet of the U-235 is removed. The bullet is placed at the opposite end of a tube from the sphere in the generator.
The high explosive is set off in the base of the barrel of what was originally a Navy cannon with a 3-inch bore, and the plug of uranium is fired up the barrel just like a cannon shell to mate with a series of target rings at the other end, and therefore to form a supercritical mass, and the fission explosion begins. A few thousandths of a second later, you would have a huge, in this case, 13.5 kiloton explosion.
Just weeks later, the military sets the date for the atomic attack on Japan. It's to take place in early August. As the days count down, Oppenheimer agonizes over the decisions he's made. He understands that his momentous scientific achievement has the ability to end World War II, but he also knows what terrifying force will descend on the Japanese people.
I think the onus of responsibility for him as the leader of this project, as essentially the creator of this weapon, was just awful.
Despite Oppenheimer's concerns, there's no turning back. The momentum to drop the bomb is too great. He has set a new course of history in motion. By August 1st, Little Boy is on the Pacific island of Tinian, fully assembled and ready to be loaded onto the fated B-29 bomber selected for the historic mission, the Enola Gay.
It had to be specially modified. It had 2 bomb bay doors, and they had to be made into one. So it was a very special machine, and it was very specially adjusted to carry this weapon.
With its 99-foot fuselage and 141-foot wings, the immense B-29 is the only American aircraft capable of carrying the 9,000-pound bomb 1,500 miles to its target in Japan.
They have to build a special pit with an elevator system so that the bomb is placed into the pit, the B-29 is towed over the pit, and then the bomb is lifted up into the aircraft.
Back at Los Alamos, Robert Oppenheimer has specific instructions for the crew when they approach the target.
Don't let them bomb if it's cloudy or if it's overcast. We've got to see the target. No radar bombing. It must be bombed visually.
On August 4th, The crew of the Enola Gay is briefed on the true nature of their top secret mission.
Whatever any of us has done before, small potatoes compared with what we're going to do now. The bomb we're going to drop is something new in the history of warfare. The most destructive weapon ever made.
August 6th, 1945. The flight crew climbs into the Enola Gay and prepares for the long journey ahead.
Taxi power.
Pilot Paul Tibbets fires up the engines and checks all systems.
Takeoff power.
As the plane taxis before takeoff, Tibbets worries about the massive weight of his deadly payload. The Enola Gay is 15,000 pounds over normal takeoff weight.
These were very long-range, very arduous flights, and he just didn't want to take any risks, so he did a long takeoff.
Tibbets knows every inch of the tarmac is precious. He must keep the plane on the runway as long as possible. And time is liftoff perfectly. There is no room for error. 1945, 2:45 a.m.
Taxi power.
A B-29 bomber races down the runway at Tinian Island in the Pacific. The Enola Gay is about to launch itself into the converging currents of man, moment, and machine. The man who's brought the bomb to life, Robert Oppenheimer, knows that a Japanese city is soon to be obliterated. That moment will occur when the Enola Gay drops her deadly payload over Hiroshima. The machine is the atomic bomb, nicknamed Little Boy. President Harry Truman has weighed the awful consequences of a nuclear attack.
I don't think there were any moral considerations of the mission. We were at war with Japan. Thousands of Allied troops in prison camps and fighting the Japanese were dying every day.
To take off in a B-29 with a full load of fuel and a 5-ton atomic bomb is no easy task, but failure is not an option. If the plane crashes, the consequences will be catastrophic. Paul Tibbets, the pilot of the Enola Gay, knows he needs to use the entire runway to reach maximum speed before he can take off. As the plane nears the end of the runway, co-pilot Bob Lewis reacts.
Bob reached up the grid to pull the yoke back and everything well before we had reached the end of the runway at the speed that he normally would pull a B-29 off on. And they just heard Paul say,
"I'm flying this damn plane."
Tibbets expertly guides the Enola Gay to takeoff with just a few feet of runway to spare. Back in Los Alamos, Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, can't stop thinking about the mission he fears will change the world forever.
He knew in the days and weeks leading up to Hiroshima that they were talking about a tremendous loss of life.
The crew of the Enola Gay is also aware of the sobering task ahead of them.
We did not go up just to bomb a city. There were shipyards there. There was ammunition works there. There's a whole lot of things there worth bombing.
At 3 a.m., Navy Commander Deke Parsons begins arming the bomb. In the cramped confines, it takes 30 minutes to remove 2 metal plates, insert 4 sections of cordite, and then replace the plates.
The decision was made that he would do the final arming of the Little Boy in flight. This would reduce the risk of an explosion if the plane crashed during takeoff.
I knew that they were going to be handling a lot of black powder there and ignition fuses and everything, and I was never real comfortable with flying in airplanes with black powder and ignition fuses and things of that type. And, you know, the whole question is, could anything go wrong there? Yes, it could. If it does, what's it going to do? Well, we're going to go down the drink, that's all.
Parsons exchanges the green plugs for red and activates the internal batteries. The arming of Little Boy is complete. The bomb is ready to be detonated. At this point, all Robert Oppenheimer can do is wait anxiously for the news of the bomb's brilliant success, or horrible failure. He's used to having control over his creations, but now he is powerless. From his office in Los Alamos, Robert Oppenheimer tries to get word from Washington about the mission's status.
John, it's Oppie.
Oppenheimer actually had one of his colleagues set up to let him know when he heard it and turned from the military.
Have you heard anything yet? They won't tell you a thing.
After more than 6 hours of flight time, pilot Paul Tibbets, navigator Dutch Van Kirk, and bombardier Thomas Farabee sight the target, the T-shaped I-O bridge in the middle of Hiroshima.
Gentlemen, this is it. This is what you've trained for.
Pilot Paul Tibbets reminds the crew about the safety precautions.
We're about to start the bomb run. I want you guys to take your goggles and put them on your forehead. When you hear the tone, pull them down over your eyes and leave them there till after the flash.
At 8:12 a.m., the Enola Gay arrives at the initial point for the bomb run. The aiming point on the ground is exactly 15 1/2 miles ahead.
5 degrees west.
Roger. It's all yours.
Bombardier Thomas Farabee and Tibbets coordinate between themselves. Farabee takes control of the plane. The T-bridge is now in the crosshairs of the Norden bomb site.
I've got it.
He engages the automatic process that will drop the bomb. A radio tone indicates the bomb will go in 15 seconds.
2, 3.
August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m. On command, the bomb door automatically opens, releasing Little Boy into the sky over Hiroshima.
Bomb bay door open.
Clear.
The bomb falls at a speed of nearly 500 miles per hour. In less than 60 seconds, it will explode 1,800 feet over Hiroshima.
When the bomb left the airplane lurched. Of course, immediately, Paul switched off the automatic pilot in order to get away from the bomb.
In Los Alamos, Robert Oppenheimer is moments away from becoming the world's most famous scientist. But he's unaware of exactly when that will happen. As Little Boy nosedives towards the target, Tibbets slams the Enola Gay into its life-saving maneuver, a sharp 155-degree turn. Every second counts as the plane speeds away from ground zero. If they are too close to the blast, they could be killed. History Channel. August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m. The Enola Gay has just released her deadly payload. As the B-29 bomber soars away from the blast site to escape the deadly explosion, Little Boy, the world's first nuclear bomb used in combat, plummets towards its target, Hiroshima, Japan. Man, moment, and machine are seconds away from impact. The man, Robert Oppenheimer, the bomb's chief architect, is 6,000 miles from ground zero. He waits for any news of the critical bombing mission. The moment is upon the Japanese city of Hiroshima, which will feel a force never before experienced by man. The machine is the atomic bomb, a weapon designed to end the bloodiest conflict in human history.
It was a horrible war. The atomic bomb was just another step in a horrible, horrible war.
The moment Oppenheimer has been both anxiously awaiting and equally dreading has begun. There is no turning back from the destructive power of the atom bomb, a power that will transform mankind forever. Eight-year-old Takashi Tanimori has no idea that in just seconds his life will be transformed.
We got to school a little after 8. Every morning we had a game called hide and seek, and I was it that morning. I was counting.
30,000 feet above Takashi, the Enola Gay's navigator, Dutch Van Kirk, is also keeping track of time.
I'm sitting in my seat holding fast. I'm looking at my watch, timing it, because I want to know about when it's ready to go off and everything of that type.
1, 2.
At 8:16 a.m., 1,800 feet over Hiroshima, Little Boy's sensors activate.
And then it's automatically triggered, and from that point on, the fission chain reaction occurs.
15, 16, 19, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Oh my God.
Little Boy explodes over Hiroshima with the force of more than 13,000 tons of TNT. The temperature in the air is nearly 2 million degrees. A huge fireball 300 meters wide envelops the city. On the ground, the cloud of noxious gas reaches 7,000 degrees, hot enough to melt metal, incinerate wood, and vaporize human flesh.
The bright light is enough to burn people for over a large distance. Then there comes a shock wave, and the city's destroyed.
The immense destructive power of the bomb engulfs Hiroshima.
A flash in the sky, explosion, and the bomb, border fired, and the entire school building collapsed. And one by one, my classmates engulfed by fires.
Robert Oppenheimer has no idea that his creation has succeeded so dramatically. It has done everything he hoped and everything he feared. Little Boy is 1,300 times more powerful than any bomb ever used in warfare.
At least 70,000 people were killed immediately. A number died later of the effects of fire primarily, because the main effect of the bomb was it started a firestorm. The whole center of the city was burned out.
The initial shockwave, traveling at 2 miles per second, reaches the Enola Gay 11 miles away.
Flak! Shockwave, Colonel. Look at that. Look at that.
As the crew watches in awe, they realize the mission has been an incredible success.
The feeling was that they had worked this hard and that they had delivered this weapon in combat, and it had been successful, and the war was over.
Shut out of the operation in which his vision has been central, Robert Oppenheimer continues to wait back at the Los Alamos lab in New Mexico. 5 hours after detonation, word is received in Washington that the mission has been accomplished flawlessly. At 11 a.m. on August 6, 1945, President Truman announces the historic bombing to the nation, along with a dire warning to Japanese leaders.
Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth.
Just minutes after Truman's speech, Oppenheimer receives the official word from his boss, General Leslie Groves.
I'm very proud of you and all of your people.
It's been a long road.
The bomb's tremendous impact on Hiroshima also impacts Oppenheimer.
The reality, I think, hit him far quicker and harder than it did the others, that this was a terrible, terrible thing that had taken place.
Takashi Tanimori is less than 1 mile from ground zero. A Japanese soldier saves his life when he pulls him from the rubble of his school. Takashi is witness to the full potential of the deadly bomb.
Then I saw one woman, and as she passed by me, and she had a baby. I don't think she knew the baby's head was blown off by the explosions.
Takashi!
Takashi's father also survives the blast. They are reunited on the banks of the Oda River.
I still remember the soldier to salute my father's wish for longevity. Then he said, I must return to the base, that I have a duty to perform.
The Japanese government is clearly in shock over this unprecedented attack.
Once they realize it is a new weapon of a different order, there's still some within the Japanese government who want to continue on with the war.
A few days after the bombing of Hiroshima, the Japanese have still not surrendered. On August 9th, 1945, the United States drops a second nuclear bomb on the city of Nagasaki. 5 days later, Japan surrenders. World War II is over.
When the bombs were dropped, for the emperor, this was a good reason for him to step in and tell the military, rather than accept their advice, that it was time to end the war.
Oppenheimer is a public hero for his role in ending the war, and his opinions on nuclear proliferation command much respect in the government. He proposes an end to the testing of any more nuclear bombs.
I feel as if I have blood on my hands.
I think most scientists did feel that this called for some international control of nuclear weapons, because once you get a whole bunch of countries with them, they're going to start using them on each other.
Oppenheimer and his colleagues had one opinion, but the Atomic Energy Commission, the president, and others, the military, had other ideas.
On August 29th, 1949, when the Russians conduct their first successful nuclear test, the communist threat overpowers Oppenheimer's arguments. With the secrets of nature unfurled before man, an even more destructive nuclear bomb, the hydrogen bomb, is being contemplated. These bombs are hundreds of times more powerful than the first atomic weapons.
And those bombs have been over 1 million times, as much as 60 million tons of TNT equivalent.
Oppenheimer argues passionately that the hydrogen bomb should never be completed.
Oppenheimer felt that they had already created a weapon that could annihilate mankind. He could not see any reason to keep going forward and to develop still more terrible bombs, as he put it.
The military, for example, believed that Soviet possession of a thermonuclear bomb without an American counterpart was unacceptable. And so that's when the opinions begin to diverge. And when Oppenheimer forcefully made his case, he made enemies in Washington.
The FBI has been tracking Oppenheimer for years because of his communist associations. Lewis Strauss, the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, files formal charges against Oppenheimer and uses the FBI files as ammunition.
They go back and find all those old accusations of socialist activity of Oppenheimer's, and new charges are brought, and Oppenheimer finds himself accused of being a traitor to his country.
I had no other thought but to serve my country.
A secret trial is convened by the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission to judge Oppenheimer's loyalties. On June 29, 1954, the commission decides to revoke Oppenheimer's security clearance. He never works on nuclear weapons again.
What we did.
Well, that was a terrible scandal. I think it's very obvious that regardless of Oppenheimer's political opinions, that he was never a spy.
People who knew Oppenheimer after he lost his security clearance in 1954 told me that he was never the same person again.
Robert Oppenheimer dies on February 18, 1967, at age 62 of throat cancer. As father of the atomic bomb, his concern for its moral implications drives a wedge between his beliefs and those of the United States government.
It's just ironic that he ended up a tragic figure and that he did what his country asked him to do, and then he was punished for it.
It's also clear that Robert Oppenheimer has serious misgivings about the awesome and ominous power he's helped bring into the world.
I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
On August 6, 1945, man, moment, and machine fuse when the ferocious power of the atomic bomb destroys Hiroshima. Whether a necessary evil to end World War II or a force of nature regrettably introduced to humans in their warring ways. Here, the M3 factor is a force forever changing our universe. One we'll continue to explore on Man, Moment, Machine.
In a standard rocket.
They were going to go to the moon, pick up a bit of dirt, take it back, and say, look at how clever we Soviets are. We've gone there, we brought back some soil without risking human life at a fraction of the cost, and look at how much money the Americans wasted in this silly political competition with us. My father never expressed any concern on my part, and I think he is a good enough engineer to understand the probabilities of there actually being some sort of a collision. Space is a very big place, and the prospect of two spacecraft colliding is pretty unlikely.
The next day, Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong become the first people in history to set foot on the moon. Armstrong is the first off the spacecraft.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The Apollo 11 mission is a shining achievement for the American space program. The Luna 15 meets a darker and little-known fate as it crashes into the lunar surface. The high drama of the moon race has its origins in the V-2 missile programs of Nazi Germany. By the end of World War II, America and Russia are moving into position for the Cold War. Both countries want Germany's rocket research.
The fact that Nazi Germany spent all that money and used all those people, including the slave laborers, to build rockets to bombard London, saved the American and Russian missile and space programs a decade or more.
America acts quickly. Within months of the war's end, 100 of the top German rocket men are in the United States. The press is told they are truck drivers, but the Germans know what they will be working on: rockets. Among them is Wernher von Braun, the director of the Nazi V-2 program and the man who will help lead America to the moon. As important as the Germans were, it was the rockets themselves, the V-2s, which would be the foundation for both the American and Soviet missile programs. The Soviet missile program is led by an unlikely figure, Sergei Korolyov, a rocket scientist who'd spent years in a Gulag prison, a victim of Stalin's purges. By 1957, Korolyov is ready to test his own creation, the R-7 Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, or ICBM. Korolyov's R-7 has 4 strap-on boosters that can power it into interplanetary altitudes and then explode it into American soil. The R-7 is revolutionary, the first missile that can deliver a nuclear warhead from one continent to another. But Korolyov's new engine design is not yet dependable. Meanwhile, a world away in New Mexico, America is having its own struggles with its modified V-2. Finally, on August 21st, 1957, Korolyov's R-7 became the world's first ICBM to fly successfully, disintegrating harmlessly as planned thousands of miles from its launching point. Suddenly, President Eisenhower is in political trouble. He's put America's resources into its huge arsenal of